Why do the greatest military minds fail when they try to conquer the Russian behemoth? Perhaps the bitter cold, endless plains, and the unbreakable spirit of the Russian people have a lesson to teach even the most invincible of leaders. Let's dive into how two of history's mightiest conquerors, Napoleon and Hitler, fell into the same trap and left behind some of the most epic military failures of all time. A tale of two overconfident leaders. Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler, separated by more than a century, shared an insatiable ambition to dominate Europe. Both dreamed of conquering Russia, envisioning a swift victory that would solidify their empires. Napoleon's Grand Armée, composed of soldiers from various nations under his rule, and Hitler's Wehrmacht, a well-oiled military machine, were both seen as unstoppable forces. However, both leaders were blinded by their own hubris. They believed that their military prowess would overcome any obstacle, including the vastness of Russia and its notorious winter. Their arrogance led them to ignore historical precedents and warnings, setting the stage for two of the most devastating military disasters in history: Napoleon's Grand Armée and its early advances. Napoleon summoned an army of over 600,000 troops, the largest Europe had ever seen, to march into Russia. Despite the size and strength of his forces, the operation was plagued with issues from the start. Napoleon's forces, comprising French, Germans, Austrians, Poles, and Italians, lacked the unity and discipline of a single nationality army. The Russians employed a scorched earth policy, burning crops and villages, leaving the French with nothing to sustain themselves. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, his army was exhausted, starving, and ill-prepared for the winter that was rapidly approaching. Moscow, abandoned and burning, offered no shelter or relief, turning Napoleon's advance into a deadly trap. Hitler's Blitzkrieg in the east. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in history, involving more than 3 million Axis troops. Hitler believed that a swift, decisive blitzkrieg would break the Soviet Union's back before winter set in. German forces quickly captured large swaths of Soviet territory, including Kiev, and encircled Leningrad. However, the German advance stalled as they approached Moscow. Despite initial successes, Hitler's decision to delay the attack on Moscow to focus on other objectives allowed the Soviets to regroup and strengthen their defenses. Stalin's refusal to capitulate, even in the face of immense losses, demonstrated the Soviet resolve that Hitler had sorely underestimated. Logistical nightmares and harsh conditions. Both invasions suffered from severe logistical failures. Napoleon's army, marching deeper into the Russian heartland, faced dwindling supplies and deteriorating morale. Similarly, the Germans were ill-prepared for the vast distances and harsh terrain of Russia. Hitler's forces, expecting a short campaign, did not carry sufficient provisions for a prolonged fight. The German supply lines were stretched thin, and the Rasputitsa, muddy season, made transportation nearly impossible. Tanks and trucks sank into the mud, and soldiers struggled to move forward, leaving the German war machine grinding to a halt. The logistical failures compounded as winter set in, turning the German advance into a battle for survival. The Russian winter. A merciless foe. The Russian winter became a legendary adversary for both Napoleon and Hitler. Napoleon's troops, dressed in summer uniforms, were unprepared for the brutal cold that fell upon them. Temperatures dropped, and soldiers froze to death. Similarly, Hitler's forces, lacking adequate winter clothing and shelter, found themselves at the mercy of General Winter. By December 1941, the temperature plummeted to -45 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing German weapons and vehicles. Soviet soldiers, equipped and trained for winter warfare, mounted a surprise counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back from Moscow. The winter transformed the battlefield into a frozen wasteland, where survival became the primary concern. The turning points. Napoleon's turning point came when he realized Moscow offered no victory. The retreat from Moscow turned into a nightmare as Russian forces harassed the retreating French army. Starvation, disease, and the cold claimed more lives than the Russians did. For Hitler, the turning point was the failure to capture Moscow in December 1941. The German advance was halted, and they found themselves on the defensive against a rejuvenated Soviet army. Hitler's refusal to allow retreats and his insistence on holding ground at all costs led to a drawn-out conflict that drained German resources and morale. These turning points marked the beginning of the end for both leaders' military ambitions. Stubborn leadership and strategic blunders. Napoleon's decision to press on to Moscow, despite the deteriorating conditions around him, was a monumental blunder. He overestimated his army's ability to sustain a prolonged campaign far from its supply bases. Hitler's strategic miscalculations mirrored Napoleon's. His delay in attacking Moscow to focus on other objectives allowed the Soviets to regroup. Additionally, Hitler's refusal to heed the advice of his generals led to disastrous consequences. Instead of consolidating his gains and preparing for the Russian winter, he continued pushing his troops into increasingly precarious situations. The insistence on holding ground, even when it meant encirclement or destruction, proved costly. The role of the Russian people. The Russian people displayed extraordinary resilience in both invasions. During Napoleon's campaign, the Russians adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying their own villages and crops to deprive the French of resources. In 1941, the Soviet Union mobilized the entire population to defend the motherland. Stalin's calls to defend Mother Russia galvanized the Soviet people. Women, children, and men dug trenches and defensive lines around Moscow. The Soviet Union managed to relocate over 1,500 factories to the east, beyond the reach of the German advance, ensuring a steady supply of weapons and equipment for the Red Army. Logistics and supply line failures. Napoleon's invasion highlighted the difficulties of supplying an army in hostile territory. As his forces moved deeper into Russia, their supply lines became overextended, and the army was forced to live off the land, which had been scorched by the retreating Russians. The German army faced similar challenges. Hitler's plan relied on capturing Soviet resources quickly, but as the war dragged on, German supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The lack of adequate fuel, ammunition, and food crippled the German advance. The harsh terrain and Russian resistance made resupply efforts nearly impossible, leading to severe shortages on the front lines. Long-term consequences. The consequences of these failed invasions were profound. Napoleon's defeat in Russia led to a widespread uprising in Europe, resulting in the collapse of his empire. His once dominant French army was reduced to a fraction of its size, leading to his abdication in 1814. Hitler's failure in Operation Barbarossa marked a turning point in World War II. It forced Germany into a protracted two-front war, draining its military and economic resources. The Eastern Front became a quagmire that consumed millions of lives and contributed significantly to the eventual Allied victory. The German army, once feared and invincible, was now on the defensive. And there you have it, two of history's greatest military blunders by two of its most formidable leaders. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical military disasters, make sure to smash that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories from history's most epic moments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.